Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to first apologise for the delay. As you saw, we just were trying to sort out the tech, which is, I don't know, still after all these years in COVID and everything being online, just a little bit unpredictable somehow, or maybe I'm just a little bit incompetent with tech sometimes. There's also that. Right, but I'm not going to waste any more time. We're very lucky today to have Professor Charlotte Villiers here from the University of Bristol to present her paper on the Sustainable Development Goals as a foundation for a new compassion-led transition to sustainability, I can almost say it, as a new paradigm for corporate law and governance. Charlotte has the perspective of having started her career in practice, specialising in employment law before, I don't know, being drawn by a desire to criticise the law more, being drawn into academia through a master's degree, and then started your career, I think, at Sheffield.
Yes.
Before moving to Glasgow, has spent time as a visiting professor at Oviedo.
Yes.
And is now a chair, professor of company law and corporate governance at the University of Bristol. This expertise that Charlotte has in corporate law, company law, sustainability law, employment law, comparative law, corporate social responsibility, business and human rights and reporting and disclosure, all of this expertise, which is wide-ranging, and specifically the paper that Charlotte's presenting today really epitomises the overlap between the areas of focus under the centres of international law and globalisation and private and commercial law, particularly around sustainability and sustainable development. And I should have said, this is a presentation, a seminar, which is being hosted by the Centre for International Law and Globalisation and the Centre for Private and Commercial Law here in the law school. But without any further delay, lateness, wasting time, I'd just like to introduce and hand over to Charlotte and check the chat.
Thank you, Emily. And thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today, to meet such a lovely audience here in Southampton, and I've already been given such warmth, so I hope that I can earn that further with the talk that I present today. So this paper is very much a paper where my background, as Emily said, is a mix of labour law and corporate law, and I feel really lucky having that mix, because as a kind of a labour lawyer, I often see the problems that corporate law presents to the worker's perspective. And so this paper sort of partly comes out of that, and it also comes from my input and interest in a large project that was led by Beate Schafgel, based at the University of Oslo. And there's a few of us in the room here who've been part of her projects, and that's very much steeped in the issues around climate change and sustainability. So this kind of paper, in a way, is a little bit of a culmination of a lot of that work from my own perspective. And I've already written a couple of papers where I've made a little bit of an argument for a more compassionate approach to the corporation. And having looked a little bit more at the Sustainable Development Goals, I feel that they perhaps give us an opportunity to pursue that approach in a little bit more detail. And so this paper explains why I think that might be. So hopefully, oh no, I'm not very good with these, am I? It should. Here we are, yeah. So just by way of a general introduction to the specific paper, I think that, you know, what's on this screen is all fairly self-explanatory. We are currently living in a world of polycrisis. And what I mean by that is we're seeing the crisis of climate, and I think that's, you know, before our eyes. My own daughter is about to go off to Sri Lanka with her medical elective, and she's wondering if she will actually be able to go, because this last week Sri Lanka has been steeped in floods. And you know, here in the UK we've seen numerous problems with the climate as well in a fairly temperate country. But we're also seeing wars and conflicts, and dare I say it, genocide. You know, in various parts of the world, we're seeing terrible, terrible geopolitical problems. And so that's just a little hint at what I mean by this word polycrisis. And alongside that polycrisis, we're seeing numerous planetary boundaries being transgressed. And that's not me saying it, that's the scientists are telling us that. And repeated reports from the IPCC are telling us that we are in real trouble. And one of the scientists who works closely as part of that international panel on climate change is Johan Rockström, and he has described the planet now as an unwell patient. And I think that's an interesting description, especially when I'm going to be talking about the word compassion. One of the things that we do with people who are ill, we treat them with compassion. That's one of the main key words in our National Health Service constitution. Compassion is an important way in which healthcare workers deal with their patients. So I think that Rockström's description is quite pertinent to this paper. And how have we approached the problem? What solutions are being put forward? Well, I guess a starting point is with the solution being presented by the United Nations in its Agenda 2030, which came out of the Paris Agreement. And with that Agenda 2030, we see the introduction of the Sustainable Development Goals, which took over from the predecessor, the Millennium Development Goals. But the problem with the Sustainable Development Goals is that they are now being described as in peril. They're not actually being pursued in the way that was intended. And there is a real concern at the level of the UN and among other commentators that we might not achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030. And one of the reasons for that lack of achievement is because of corporate behaviours. And I'll explain that as I go through the paper. And I think that the corporate behaviours that are problematic stem from the paradigm in which corporations and the corporate actors operate. And that paradigm is largely recognised as one of pursuing the shareholders' interests first, and that our general basic understanding of the corporation is that it is an entity that is designed and promoted for the purpose of making profit. And that paradigm is the threat very much to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And so in this paper, I argue that perhaps we could shift the paradigm, and the paradigm that I would like us to shift towards is one that is with compassion, humanity, and thinking in terms of systems-based thinking. So that's what this paper is really seeking to do. So let's just remind ourselves as what are the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm sure that most of us in this room are familiar with at least the concept, if not the goals themselves. But just to remind ourselves, there are 17 such goals, and within those 17 goals, there are 169 targets, and they cover what we might describe as the 5 Ps. Their concern, or the focus of the goals, is on people, planet, prosperity, peace, and partnership. And what the goals together are really trying to improve the situation for people and planet. So I think that's an interesting starting point when we start to think about the concept of compassion, because compassion is about connection and thinking about our actions and how they impact on other people. And what's interesting about the Sustainable Development Goals, perhaps more than their predecessor, is that the SDGs themselves have targeted business and corporations as the predominant entities through which these goals might be achieved. And they've probably done that because obviously the corporations tend to be the entities with the resources in which we might use and need to be able to pursue these goals. But there's also an understanding at the UN level, and even within its Agenda 2030, it's stated that corporations are selected as key actors in this because they have the ability to innovate, they have the ability to operate and impact various parts of the planet. So it sort of makes sense that we would be choosing business and the business actors to be our main pursuers of these SDGs. They're not on their own. Obviously, states and state actors are part of the story. But in order to persuade the corporate actors to go along with this, because it does cost money to pursue these goals, a number of commentators have suggested, well, it's in their interests to do so. First of all, it helps corporations to improve their own reputation and their legitimacy. One writer, Pedersen, has said that the SDGs themselves provide a crystal ball on future investments and opportunities, and they themselves provide the inspiration for the innovations that might take place within the business activities. So there's a kind of a partnership element to this, and it kind of also continues this idea that we've seen for a very long time in the CSR sphere, the corporate social responsibility arguments, of doing well by doing good. So there's very much a pursuit of the business case for developing along the lines of these SDGs. Yet despite that, as I've already hinted, there's been a real lack of progress with these SDGs. And there's lots of evidence that's telling us that they're not actually being achieved in the way that we would have hoped. So only a year ago, the United Nations itself said that of approximately 140 targets that can be evaluated, half of them show moderate or severe deviations from the desired trajectory. In other words, we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. And more than 30% of the targets have experienced no progress at all. So it's a really disappointing outcome. And there's also been a very selective implementation of the SDGs by corporations. And in the written paper, I provide that evidence more fully. But the point being made is some corporations will say, oh, we'll take Sustainable Development Goal 2, but we won't bother with 12. Or we'll take Goal 3, but we won't bother with 9. They're being very selective about which goals they want to pursue. Now, that might be because they've got particular expertise that fits with one of the goals, but it does mean that you've got cherry picking and a degree of chaos, really. It's not clear which goals are going to be pursued and which will be just left behind. And these whole goals are meant to prevent a coherent whole. One of the problems as well is that the goals together are very complex. That complexity leads to them being rather limited. So it may be that some corporations prefer to be selective because it's easier to be selective rather than try and pursue every goal going. They might think that that's not possible, it's not plausible, so we'll take one at a time. It could be that. But the problem is that to understand how they work together, that becomes quite difficult. So what we've ended up with is a number of companies operating in what's called SDG washing, and that's an extension of the problem of greenwashing or blue washing. And we are seeing evidence of SDG washing by some corporations. Another problem is that there may, for some corporations, appear to be a disconnect between the Sustainable Development Goals and the business purpose of making profit. And so, you know, persuading the corporate actors to go fully on board with the SDGs means that they are going to have to sacrifice some of those profits, and that there are also a number of how to put it. What's the oh my mind, I'm getting old. When we sort of have to like, I give you something and you'll have to give something back to me. What's the word? Trade-offs, that's the word, trade-offs. Yeah, that's it, trade-offs. And a further problem is that the SDGs themselves are subject to criticism. They themselves go along with the idea of pursuing growth. SDG 8, for example, it actually talks about specifically the word growth. And so SDG 8 is about decent work and economic growth. And if we are thinking about growth, we need to be really careful about what we mean by that, because growth itself can be problematic in terms of sustainability. So we end up with things like what's called the Jevons paradox. So, for example, if we say, oh, we're all going to go towards electrification of vehicles in order to reduce our emissions. So the person who buys the electric vehicle says, great, I can drive further now because I'm not giving out as much carbon. But actually they're using the roads even more. So we end up with this paradox that whilst we're trying to cut back on emissions, we end up perhaps creating yet more emissions because we're engaging further in the activities that might spoil the planet. And we know that, like, electrification of vehicles is a really good example of a number of paradoxes. So it requires mining of various minerals, and that in itself causes all sorts of problems in terms of human rights violations, environmental damage. So though that mining of minerals for the electric cars may be saving on fossil fuel energy use, but it's still not helping the environment necessarily. So there are a number of contradictions in all of this. So with the SDGs themselves, there are still risks around extraction and exploitation and environmental damage. It doesn't go away necessarily with pursuit of these goals. But for this particular paper, I'm arguing that the SDGs themselves, on the whole, are something that we should be pursuing. But the problem is that if we're targeting the corporations, we need to be aware of the sorts of paradigms that determine that corporate behaviour and the corporate activities. And the problem that we have is that most companies, not all, we've got numerous entities that are like benefit corporations or socially aware corporations, social enterprise type corporations. But your typical general corporation is one that is pursuing shareholder wealth maximisation. And in our corporate law over the last 50 years or so, certainly the UK corporate law has been, to a large extent, not completely, there's a number of academics in this room who would be arguing very much against this approach, but to a large extent we've seen some influence from the American law journals in the kind of law and economics sphere, in which there's been an emphasis on efficiency, profit maximisation, and the shareholder primacy model has come to dominate our thoughts. Many of us, as I say, in this room would take an issue with that approach, but I think it's fair to say that this is a mainstream way of thinking. We only have to look at our newspapers or just listen to the news programmes where we see shareholders being identified as the owners of the corporations. And us corporate lawyers know that that's actually not strictly the case. But the general, like lay person's thinking at least, is that corporations are owned by the shareholders, and therefore the shareholders' views should have priority. But within that paradigm, we see lots of problems. It leads to profits being enjoyed by a few people at the expense of a large number of other people. Look in this country itself, the wealth gap between rich and poor is growing massively. And we're seeing that, a few people at the very top of these corporations have a lot of wealth and assets, while other people are struggling to pay their bills. And so that this is a really problematic paradigm within which these corporations are operating. We end up also with a problem of corporations dictating how the rest of us should live our lives. And we see, for example, the influence of corporate actors, large shareholders, the big financial investors, having influence over our political discussions. Look, we've got an election going on right now in this country, and it's quite clear that many of the corporate actors are kind of switching camp. They can see that the Conservative Party could well lose this election. I don't want to make big predictions because we've seen this before, but we're seeing a lot more moving across to the Labour Party, giving donations to them. And I would argue, I'm a bit of a cynic, getting old now, and I would argue that very rarely do these people give money across and don't want something back for it. Okay, so there's a worry that corporations are beginning to dictate to us how we should be living our lives and organising our societies. Furthermore, often, not always, but often corporations tend to attract more narcissistic people to be their leaders. There's quite a large literature on this now, that they're not all run by bad people, but they tend to be more likely to attract more narcissistic people than other entities. So there is actually a literature that provides evidence for that. And this is all supported by our employment laws, actually. Our employment laws in this country are pretty useless. Okay, we all think we've got rights at work, but when it comes to trying to enforce those rights, we often hit a wall. Okay, here in the academic world, we've certainly seen problems over the last 5 or 6 years or more in terms of our industrial action. How far has it really got any of us, quite frankly? And it's partly because our employment laws are very weak. And the managerial prerogative, which is at the centre of our labour law, tends to help the big people at the top of these corporations. What we end up with is a discontextualised form of competition and a disconnected form of capitalism. And that's really problematic in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are about making life easier for people who are suffering, really. This disconnected capitalism, we were talking at lunchtime about Thames Water. And we've got numerous corporations in this country that are causing problems for how we are living our lives. But if you look at who are the shareholders in Thames Water, many of those shareholders actually live thousands of miles away. They're not living in this country seeing the rubbish in our rivers or on our beaches. They don't care. And so this is a real problem, I think, that we have this disconnection in our capitalism, that we have the structures mean that those who are benefiting from these corporate activities are not necessarily seeing the suffering that's also caused by these corporate activities. They're at a distance from it. And in the end, the whole world is suffering with inequalities, human rights abuses, environmental degradation, and the impacts are felt far worse in the global south. And those impacts are often hidden from the stakeholders who enjoy the benefits of those corporate activities here in the global north. So that paradigm, I would say, is a poisonous paradigm. And I think that we need to shift the paradigm. And I see the SDGs as an opportunity, as a door opening to a change of paradigm. And I think that's possibly where this paper hopefully is offering something new. I think that within the SDGs, when we look at them together and when we look at the Agenda 2030, the sentiment, at least, is about alleviating or taking away people's suffering. It's about stopping problems that affect people in certain parts of the world. It's about improving the environment so that we can all enjoy the planet more. It's about looking after other species. When we look at the SDGs, that's what they're about. They're about alleviating hunger, taking away poverty, providing clean water, providing education. Equality is one of the SDGs. So I would say that within that, we see a kernel of compassion because it's about alleviating suffering, and that's what compassion is also about. And it's not just me saying that, there are other commentators who've spotted this about the SDGs. So whilst they are weak and they are problematic, I absolutely accept that. I do think that the thinking behind them has a compassionate edge. It's about coming together to alleviate suffering and to nurture human flourishing. But what do we mean by compassion? There are numerous definitions. There's a very big literature on compassion in the world, in the psychology journals, in the management journals, which is interesting. There's a large literature on compassion. But basically, when we look at all the definitions, what they boil down to are 4 elements. Noticing someone is suffering, connecting with that person who is suffering, sharing in their suffering, and then trying to find ways to alleviate that person's suffering. When we look at all the various definitions, that's really what they boil down to. It's noticing another person's suffering and looking to try and make things better for that other person. So it goes beyond empathy. Empathy is important, and so is kindness. They're really big words and they're good words, but they're not enough. Because the difference that takes us towards compassion is that compassion actually involves action. So when we're watching the television, I don't know about you, but like I've seen children like in parts of the world where they're suffering hunger, tears come to my eyes. But what do I do about it? You know, the next thing comes on the telly and I've forgotten. That doesn't mean to say I didn't have empathy with those people, but I haven't been compassionate to them because I've done nothing for them. Compassion is about taking action, seeking to alleviate the problem. It requires an emotional connection, and I think that's really important. It's about having some emotional intelligence. It's really feeling that other person's pain and saying, I need to do something about this. And the SDGs encourage us to do that because they are about aiming to reduce suffering. So they encourage that action part of compassion. And the idea behind the SDGs is to leave no one behind. They have a humanitarian basis to them. And I think what's really interesting as well is that the UN, often you see people wearing those little pin badges that represent the SDGs, and they're always in a circle. And I think that's really interesting. I'll go on to talk about that in a moment. But when we look at the circle, the idea, I think, of the circle for these SDGs is to highlight that they interconnect with each other. They're not hierarchical. They're all connected in one way or another to each other. So that's why the circle is there, I think. So it reflects the symbiotic connections and the interrelations. And that also links to the idea of systems thinking. So what do we mean by systems thinking? Again, there's a big literature on this whole area, but I like Donella Meadows' approach. She's one of the early systems thinkers, and she says that when we're thinking about a system, we look at all of the parts. So looking at this front bench here, okay? Each person on this front bench is really important. But imagine what comes together when you all come together. What does this front bench now represent? Something huge, something fantastic. I think that's what Donella Meadows is getting. That, you know, when we think about systems, we're thinking about a whole thing that is more than the sum of its parts. And we have to kind of look at how the parts interrelate with each other. And we look at, you know, when we look at her book, she talks about the inputs and the outputs. But you know, you put something in, the same thing won't come out. Something different's come out because it's connected with other things. And so when it comes out at the other end, you've got something different. So this is the feedback loops that we see in the systems thinking literature. And from the perspective of compassion, I think that's really important because systems thinking or compassionate thinking is about understanding how my actions might affect you, or my actions might affect you. What happens to you when I do a certain thing, and vice versa. So it's also about seeing the world from somebody else's perspective. And in the context of the SDGs, the global north and the global south need to find ways to come together. It's about understanding each other. It's also about identifying patterns, seeing connections, etc. And I come back again to the circle. Rather than having the hierarchical structure that many of us in the corporate law arena seem to understand as our corporate structures, if we think about it in terms instead of humanistic circles, and there are many organisations that do adopt circles for discussions, you know, and we see it in some government parliaments. In the Scottish Parliament, it's a circular building, isn't it? And I think that's very deliberate because it's about looking across at each other. It's about talking to each other, not looking up or down on each other. So the idea is circles are about building those relationships and those connections. And there's a potential here for generating a collective consciousness. And I think this is where we need to shift the paradigm. There is scientific evidence of humans having the potential for compassion. I think inherently we have compassion within us. You know, we are affected when we see another person crying. It does affect us. There is an innate ability for compassion within us. But we need to then to act on it. We need to be able to acknowledge and address the problems that we see. That then becomes compassionate action. So how might we achieve this in our corporate governance or our corporations? Actually, there are a number of places that we can point to of where we can easily put right some of the problems. Take, for example, the pay levels. I've already hinted at the problems of inequality. And we see in a number of our corporations, many of the major, really successful firms pay the minimum wage when they know they could pay way above that minimum wage, actually. Meanwhile, those at the very top are earning $1 million, more than $1 million. You know, the pay differentials are enormous. And the shareholders taking their dividends. Thames Water again, what we've talked about. We know that the shareholders were taking their dividends while the stakeholders, as in the employees, possibly, I don't know what the pay levels are like there, but I suspect they're not wonderful for those lower down, but certainly for their customers getting high bills and the people swimming in the sea and the rivers, not enjoying life very much, really. But do those shareholders care? Do the top ones at the top of the firm really care? So a place we could start is by reducing the pay gaps that would be a signal towards a more compassionate approach. That's a very easy win. But there's also, well, there are lots of areas in which we can talk more about that, and I'll go on to explain a little bit further. A starting point is learning our lessons from the SDGs, these circles. They're about us connecting with each other. My being connects to your being. And I think it's really interesting that, the SDGs are about the planet. And so therefore, us here in the very, lucky global north, largely, we need to be learning from some brilliant lessons that the global south can offer us. And so, for example, there are a number of philosophies and ways of life in different parts of the global south that I think really speak to these SDGs. So in parts of Africa, we have the philosophy of Ubuntu. And that's a really interesting philosophy because it's very much about connecting with each other. I am because you are. I'm a person, but my personhood has been built by the people around me. Ubuntu is about understanding our interactions with each other. So that's one philosophy that we can learn a lot from. And yet I only kind of stumbled upon this philosophy. You don't really see it in the corporate law journals of the global north. You might see it in the Twale literature, but I've not come across it in the company law literature of the global north. And then the Buen Vivir is another philosophy coming from Ecuador, quite similar. It's very much a philosophy based on our connection with nature, Buen Vivir. And the idea of it is we should act in a way that connects to our local community. And corporations, the idea from Buen Vivir would be that the corporation is a part of that community. So it shouldn't be just doing things that are just imposed on the community, but decisions taken by that corporation should involve the community. And there are other philosophies, the Tikanga philosophy of the Maoris. It's similar, again, it's about connection. So I think the global south offers us a lot if we want to change our paradigm. And the practical significance of all of this, one might say, well, that all sounds lovely, Charlotte, but how do you put it into practice? I think we can take a lot and put it into practice. I think it's about really giving much more space for teamwork. In the universities, teamwork's a really important thing, and I've never seen teamwork actually undermining what we want to do. Mutual respect, of course, but from the corporate law perspective, participatory democracy is really key. Involving the people who will actually have to suffer the impact of our actions and our decisions is really important. And I think that, the role of trade unions here is really key, because trade unions are typically and traditionally spaces of connection. So I think that that's something that we can pick up on. And Van Noren, who is quite critical of the SDGs, doesn't say we should abandon them, but there are things that we could change about them to really build on some of these other global south ideas. So rather than just pursuing the word development, we should perhaps, according to Van Noren, replace that word and talk about sustainable interrelationship building. I think that's really interesting. And for the end result oriented goals, she suggests that we should replace those with process thinking and thinking in a cyclical nature. Look at the word cyclical, sort of close to circle again. And she's talking about earth governance. And so she thinks, don't abandon the SDGs, but as they are currently sit, they're not perfect. But I'm interested in how she's suggesting we should change them. I think chime with my idea of compassion. And really, I suppose the key point about the SDGs is that they encourage a transition away from a linear growth economy. They're very much about a circular economy, although there are question marks around that. SDG 8 is problematic in terms of the circular economy, potentially. But we can see that there are connections among them. There are synergies and there are trade-offs. So goal 8, for example, decent work and economic growth, but then that leads to a potential for more extraction. Again, another circle that's connected to this discussion is the donut economy idea. Kate Raworth's donut economy, she's talking about the circular donut, not the big fat jammy one. She said, what we need to do is to be living within the sweet spot, i.e. in between the planetary boundaries that her donut kind of symbolises. And then degrowth and well-being, I think, they question the notion of GDP as an appropriate measure of progress. I've already mentioned that some corporations already adopt circles in their kind of management processes, and so some management scholars will be familiar with the idea of the Kaizen circle or the Deming cycles, where they are talking about circles of continuous improvement. So rather than being hierarchical or rather than sort of going in one direction, they say these are cycles of improvement. We keep on learning every time. We learn from each other. And I see this as a kind of ethical approach to corporate governance. It's more about values and virtues than just compliance and codes. We can all tick the boxes, but actually, what does that really mean? And for many years, we've been trying in the corporate governance arena to move away from tick box approach to management. We're constantly trying to say, this is about, you know, working with the spirit of this code, not just its letter. And there have been hints of an understanding about these problems and the need for change. And so, for example, in Mauritius and in India, we've seen very small changes, but I think they're small but important signals from these new ways of looking at corporate law. So in India, they've got the corporate social responsibility provision, which requires large companies to give a small 2% of their profits towards good projects, shall we say. Now, it's far from perfect, but I think that it's a signal that there is an understanding that we need to shift the direction somewhat. And I've already mentioned that we could tackle inequality by closing the pay gaps. And coming on to that, there's a really lovely book that's recently been published by Ingrid Robbins. She's a Dutch philosopher. And her book is called Limitarianism, and it's published by Penguin. It's a lovely book, and she argues that there should be a maximum imposed on somebody's wealth. So she's not just talking about pay, she's talking about people's wealth, and she thinks that we could have a maximum. How you do it, or maybe through taxation, you know, but the argument is a philosophical argument that a person doesn't need so much beyond a certain level of wealth. Stakeholder involvement is absolutely key, but that I think much more broadly than we've often seen discussed in our corporate law journals here in the UK. I think we need to be thinking stakeholders through the supply chain. In other parts of the world, we need to find ways to be able to involve those people in the decision-making processes. And then we can look to our own health service, which is really, really struggling, okay? But some of the writers in the area of health have explored ideas of compassion because it's part of the NHS's constitutional, sort of goes through the veins of it. And so there's been a lot of thinking on how do we treat people in a compassionate way. And in terms of the workforce, Roger Klein has said, well, we need to be thinking about making the space psychologically safe so that people can speak up if they feel the need to, being supportive of each other, having positivity, empathy, that word, leadership, and he talks about in an aggregate, compassionate leadership way. So he's using that word again, and innovation. I guess the point I'm making here is that, it's not just me dreaming this up. There's lots of other people in other spaces thinking about the need to be more compassionate. So to conclude, I think we just need to be honest. I think that late capitalism is hugely problematic. I think it's now being understood as problematic. I think more and more people are questioning the capitalist system in which we're operating. And we can see quite visibly now the problems. The climate change problems are absolutely undeniable. And this is threatening our well-being, and it's threatening the planet's existence, potentially. So by keeping the profit an exploitative paradigm and continuing to prioritise shareholder wealth, I think that is a route to further problems. So it is also time for action, in my opinion. There are solutions and there are lots of them, but we need to have a specific mindset. And my mindset is to say, let's go down this compassionate road. Other things haven't worked, so why don't we try this? And the SDGs offer us a blueprint for that, just by their own interconnectedness, that what they symbolise. And I think they offer us that not just for the corporations, but for governments as well. And I think that overall compassion, together with systems thinking and a humanitarian approach, may actually be the thing that allows us to achieve those SDGs. So thank you very much for listening. I'm open to questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Charlotte. I think everyone would agree that that was a tremendously rich paper, and it's rich in ideas and also the refreshing optimism, right, that the SDGs do provide this blueprint. It's very easy to be critical. Yeah. You referred to some of the criticism of the SDGs. It's very easy to be jaded and to be cynical. It's much more difficult to create a constructive, positive case for moving forward, and I think that's what you've done here. And I think you've reminded the room, the people who are with us online, of the importance of the goals and of the real potential to shift the paradigm, as you've said. So I think there's a real kind of clarion call for action in your paper, and refreshing optimism, and I think that's great. And I'd love to ask lots of questions, but I'm not going to abuse the position of the chair. I am going to open the floor for questions. Yeah. Alan.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was an invitation to think about alternatives and also think about different concepts, right, across a wide range of disciplines, not only law. I've got two questions, or perhaps one question and one comment, right? So, I'm curious about, because you mentioned SDG 8.
Yes.
And I think that, and you touched upon that during your presentation, as sometimes a bit more difficult to see there how we, how corporate behavior, right, would contribute to that. I mean, thinking about, for instance, the informal sector, right, the informal work sector, in particular in the global south. Right?
Yeah.
It's just a question, an open question to you. If you could elaborate more on that, how do you see things with regard to that particular SDG 8? And the other one I was thinking is more a comment about how can we drive a change in corporate behavior. And one of my PhD students is working in Nigeria about how to drive corporate behavior in the right direction in terms of the just transition, etc., etc. So I was thinking, I mean, there are clear benefits there, but so many obstacles. Right?
Yes.
How can we, and each country presents its own set of challenges, right? Mm-hmm. So it's more a comment about that, right? So how difficult is it in a particular context to implement that? And I like the one Villiers.
Yeah.
And I know another PhD student working in integrating the WMPV into corporate management, into a managerial sort of setting. So these ideas for the new generations, for our new generations of PhD, I think they're quite appealing. I don't know, I mean, she is in the second year, I believe, but I think, again, very innovative. I quite liked your presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you. Shall I answer that one? Yeah. Okay, so on the SDG 8, I think it is probably one of the more controversial of the goals, because I don't think any of us are going to say we don't like the idea of decent work. But with decent work, maybe that kind of goes along with growth. But there's from what I can see, a lot of the argument is around what do you mean by growth here? Because just pursuing growth often leads, you get that feedback loop, which means that you're perhaps damaging the environment even more, or you're paying people less or giving them less good conditions. So there's a tension, I think, in that SDG 8. And I think that the paper touches on the fact that there's a whole discussion around growth, degrowth. And I think, that's a really controversial area. And I haven't made my mind up on that, because on the one hand, like, I'm really go along with Jason Hickel and his degrowth argument, but is there a worry that could have unintended consequences and lead to some people completely being left behind? I just don't know enough about that argument, and it's something that I say in the conclusion of the paper that requires further.
I think it's very interesting, and again, I was recently at the BIBA, during the BIBA, and the PhD student was working on the interrelations between labor and environment in the context of climate change. Very interesting. So
yes, and I think that there are lots of tensions in this. So, for example, take the energy sectors. If we say we're just going away completely from fossil fuel, what happens to the workers in those sectors? Are we going to be able to replace their jobs with other
just transition dilemma?
Very much. And how do you drive the corporate sector? I think that there's two possible avenues here. We could either take the harder route, which involved changing the laws and making those laws really enforceable, and that's slow. It could be seen as antagonistic, but it might be more effective than the other route, which I think is possible, which is looking at good examples. And there are lots of good examples out there. And I think that's something that we do lack a lot in our corporate law discussions about, should we be pointing and really highlighting the good corporations and the good companies, whether they be the style of entity. So we might be looking towards benefit corporations, or your social enterprises, or cooperatives. I'm a big in favour of cooperatives very frequently. They may provide us with a lot of good examples and inspirations, and even like for-profit corporations. We've got some great examples. I often use the example of Timpson's to my students. I like that corporation. It's had a really interesting story. And so I think maybe we could point to them, but I wonder if that's going to do the job. I'm not sure it would. I think it's too soft. So perhaps we need a mix of pointing to the good examples, but also having enforceable laws in the background.
Yeah, so in the business of human rights, we often discuss giving tips. We need to give tips.
I mean, I think so in the sustainability kind of movement, there seems to be this kind of doing by suing approach, which is really interesting. We touched a little bit on it at lunchtime.
I think that's very interesting. I mean, I think that's a recent shift. Suing, we were discussing that the content of the lawsuits is not always possible.
There's no guarantees, no guarantees at all with it. But I think it raises an awareness and a greater awareness around risk and liability for the risks that we take. So that may encourage better behaviours. But it's all a bit soft, isn't it? And then on your point about Gwenvivier, that's really exciting that you've got students here in the Global North looking at those philosophies.
Yeah, in the
really
context, I think the UK, some universities, you have that space and, and the context, right, to explore these
Yes,
issues.
very much so. I really hope that they complete and get that work out there. That's exciting. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in before Belle comes back with further observations. Are there any more questions? Yes, I thought there might be. But what I'm going to do this time is if we take 3 questions and then you can have a little think about them. And I think there were 3 hands went up very quickly in the front row there.
Well, you can go first.
Sure. It was brilliant. Thanks, Charlotte. You started off saying that the corporate entity was kind of configured for shareholder interests. The more time that goes by, the more I think about it, the more I think that's completely true, and that we can't get away from it. And so everything that followed after that, I was thinking of in that light and thinking it's configured for shareholder interests. Shareholders have got more powerful. We're all trying to retire and we're funneling more money into these big shareholders. Rich people are funneling more money into the big shareholders. Shareholders have got control. Shareholders are driving stuff directly and indirectly. And so what can we do about it? And you told us about the SDGs, and I was thinking, are we relying on the companies to deliver the SDGs? We're relying a bit on our governments to deliver the SDGs. Ideally, our government would start looking at companies and saying companies are not really compatible with the SDGs and we need to change the law. That's not going to happen. So I wanted to kind of just push you a little bit to think about what we might do to change things, or whether you can see things that are potentially making things better, potentially defocusing the corporate entity on the shareholders, and making it focus on something else. And I was thinking that we talked a bit earlier about CSDDD being one thing. So I wondered whether you had anything to say about that. I could go on for much longer without getting any of my questions.
Absolutely.
Very happy to come second. I think it talks to Andrew's question. So I agree that disclosure, CSR, they haven't really moved the needle in the way that we need. But I wonder if you have any views on other pieces of legislation, such as taxonomies or such as transition plans, such as the CSDDD, which I think might play an important role in helping us deal with the complexity and with translating the science into legal consequences, which I think has been really missing from the debate. We talked about the Klein Earth case during lunch. I think that was a bit of the consideration there. I think everybody agrees that outcome-based bonds work better than all the other sort of sustainable finance products, but they're too easy too hard to design, so nobody really uses them. So how those might differ. A second question, if I may. I think when it comes to the SDGs, trade-offs are really the key question. To give you one example, from last week, I was in the discussions of the Standing Committee on Finance of the COP. And one of the big discussions this year is the definition of climate finance. Especially because low-income countries and middle-income countries are very worried about global north countries relabeling development finance as sustainable finance. So my question in that sense is maybe a bit lateral, but what sort of legal instruments or what legal frameworks can potentially help us to navigate the trade-offs? Because I don't think that SDGs themselves are very helpful in doing that. So I wonder if you had any thoughts on that.
Okay. Should I answer those before Brenda asks?
Yeah, that's probably quite a lot to answer.
Okay. They're great questions though. Thank you.
So we'll do with these 2 and then we'll come back.
Okay, so your point about the shareholder interest is a real worry. It's something that I lay awake in bed at night trying to, I don't know about you, but that's one of the downsides of being an academic. It's a beautiful, privileged job, I feel so privileged to have this job, but it does come with its downsides, and one of them is, I don't know if it's because we're in law, but I'm constantly feeling this need to solve the world's problems. And it does keep me awake. And one of them is, what do we do with the shareholders? Because they are a real problem. They're always in the background. That background existence of theirs is so weighty on the shoulders of the directors. And yet we have, I feel that our corporate law and our corporate governance system is full of contradictions and paradoxes. So like, whilst on the one hand, we're saying that the directors must become accountable to the shareholders and the reporting is there, at the same time, we're looking to align their interests by the bonus payments or by the pay structures that are developed. It doesn't make sense. I feel that there is a need to create some duties. I mean, I know that there's a whole discussion around fiduciary duties for shareholders, and I do think that that is going to be necessary. But of course, then that you run into the problem of, well, who's going to want to go and invest then? How will you attract them? But there's a real tension there, and I do think that the shareholders have at least a moral responsibility, but I think we need some legal responsibilities imposed upon them. Coming then to the issue around complexities, like you both mentioned the CS-DDD. Are you all familiar with that in the room? So it's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which has just finally been adopted, very watered down, but do I see hope in it? I think I do. If any of you are on LinkedIn, you see there's a real buzz around ESG investing and the responsibilities around ESG investing, sustainability reporting, and now this CS-DDD. I definitely sense that people out there in the kind of at the coalface are worried about these laws. I really do think that. So I've been talking to people locally in Bristol, so PwC, Osborne Clark, various people, and they do feel that there is a sea change, not partly with the CS-DDD, but also with the fact that auditing is now coming into play seriously. Now, for many years, I've been quite sceptical about the role of the auditors, but the fact that that is now becoming a necessity with these reports is making people sit up and think, hang on, what do I say? So there's a trend towards, away from greenwashing towards now green hushing. They're saying, actually, we better not mention it because someone's going to slap us. So I think that's interesting. It might lead us to another unintended consequence. I don't know. It's too early to say. But as far as the CS-DDD, I think it's a really important step legally, symbolically as well. But I think we need to see a rebalancing of the power structures within supply chains. So I've been reading a couple of things that are suggesting to me that suppliers in some parts of the world are really worried about this because they don't have the resources to deal with the data that they then need to pass up the chain. So we might find a kind of compliance fatigue step in very quickly, and that will need to be dealt with. A complexity is a massive problem. I mean, just here in the UK, again, talking with people locally in Bristol, we Brexited, but we're still going to have to deal with the European laws. There's no doubt about that. And now, of course, we've got a potential change of government. So I don't know what the Labour government, if it is Labour, what they will bring in, but the Conservative government have been doing work. They've not sat on their bottoms doing nothing. They have been doing work, but it's been slow. So they've been creating their own taxonomy. It's not complete. So I hope that doesn't get abandoned. They've created some new standards, haven't they? So there's work going on, but of course what we've created is several layers of regulation, and that's really costly for clients dealing with their lawyers and their accountants, working which ones do I have to comply with, which ones do I need to, what do I need to do? So I still think complexity is a major problem, I really do, and I don't think that's going to get any easier anytime soon. And then finance, well, I've just also written a paper, it's almost complete, but the title of my paper is Sustainable Finance, a Pact with the Devil. I don't trust the finance people. Why would I trust them? So far, is all we've seen is them pushing for certain results. I just don't have faith in that. I think we'll see more of the Jevons paradox problem coming through with sustainable finance. Look at ESG investing. It's weak. So, I mean, I don't know where I'm going to send that paper. Because I know I'm going against the current zeitgeist with thinking on this. And I understand the thinking, we need to resource this stuff. We've got to get the finance, but I think we need to impose things on those with the money. We can't just rely on them. I think we need to impose some responsibilities on them. I really do. So I think that's missing from what I can see from the European sustainable finance agenda. It looks like they're putting them up on a pedestal, but actually I'm not seeing any real requirements being imposed on them. So I find that problematic. So I hope that answers your questions.
And then I think Brenda had a question as well. So
yes.
Hi, thank you for the presentation, it was brilliant. So my question is about the compassion for SGDs. In the beginning of the presentation, you mentioned that the pay gap between individuals are increasing, especially and also between developed and developing countries.
Yes.
And also you mentioned that the living expenses are rising, and we know there's an global economic crisis.
Yeah.
And we also know that SGDs comes with a price, with a cost.
Yes.
And you also mentioned that there's evidence that we are moving away from SGD goals. So my question is about the relation between compassion and the financial situation of the world.
Yeah.
So do you think in the future, assuming that the global economy is not getting any better, do you think it's possible to expect compassion towards SGDs? Do you think it's likely to happen, or do you think we should have other mechanisms except for compassion or everything? So do you think the financial situation is relevant to the compassion, or because they can be still exist together?
Yeah, that's a really nice question. Thank you. I think that the SDGs give us an understanding of the need for recognizing our interconnections with each other. I think that's what they provide to me. So they are complex. And trying to apply them in a technical way is of course going to be complex, but bringing them down to their basics, what they symbolize to me is we have to work together as human beings across all parts of the planet, because what I do here in the UK is probably likely to affect somebody in Brazil, around the Amazon. For example, the things that I use, or if I want to purchase a new instrument, or driving my car, or whatever it be, anything. But it's going to affect other parts of the world, because it requires digging for the minerals for those bits, or deforesting bits of the Amazon, whatever. So my actions interact with their actions. But there's a power in difference, and that power, I think, difference comes from where the resources, the financial resources, are situated. And I don't believe that the global economy, that there's not enough money. I think there's plenty of money going around. It's just hidden in bank accounts in certain parts of the world, in truth. And I think that our taxation systems, this is an ongoing conundrum for us, isn't it? Because I think we somehow need to find an international answer to the problems of tax, because that's what I see as the issue here. Here in this country, I mean, we are one of the richest nations. What are we, number 6 nation? But yet there's a shed load of poverty in this country. Why? Because there's not enough tax being paid. There's tax avoidance going on crazily, and those with the wealth are hiding that wealth. It's not even in this country. So I don't believe that the economy, that there's not enough money. I think there is enough money. I think it just needs to be shared. And that's why I like Ingrid Robbins's book, where she's talking about the moral argument for limiting amounts of wealth that one person should enjoy in comparison with another person. I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I think we do still have time. Thank you very much, Charlotte. I think we do still have time for another question or questions.
Lily, Ben, or
I think there is
Yes.
one at the back. There might be, I'm trying to look for hands. There are a couple. So I think we've got time for one more round. Don't we book through until midnight? Do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Charlotte. Really interesting presentation. I just
Thank you.
wondered if I could get your views on this idea of maybe the diametrically opposed main notion of shareholder value or profitisation versus compassion, and whether or not they are diametrically opposed, or whether there's some sort of middle ground. Because if we perhaps look at this idea of change and reform,
Yeah.
how do we do good? Well, we live in a capitalist society. I don't see that changing. So following that logic, then we need some capital to do the good. So
Yes.
sort of like Carroll's pyramid notion, for example.
Yeah.
Are they diametrically opposed, or do we need some capital to do the good? And if so, are they opposed, or is there a middle ground, I suppose, is the question.
Yeah.
And then Brenda, do you want to come in? I've kept you waiting so long. So.
No, it's fine, but just sort of want to answer that first, because my sort of questions are long and varied.
Yeah, and is there anyone else who I can't see because of angles? No,
I'm
we
certainly
good.
happy to answer that question.
Yeah.
I think the shareholders are really vital to the conversation here. Yes, we do live in a capitalist society, and I suspect that I think we're in late capitalism, but I don't think capitalism will be gone before I die. Quite honestly, I think I will always be stuck in a capitalist system. So therefore, the shareholders' role becomes vital again. And I'm not saying that shareholders shouldn't profit, but I think that there should be a sharing of that profit, a much more equitable sharing of the goods. Because at the end of the day, who's doing the work that leads to the profits that go into the shareholders' pocket? It's as simple as that for me. An interesting example recently was with the Royal Mail industrial dispute. So Royal Mail has gone through a horrible time. We all know that. And we know as well that Daniel Kretinsky, the Czech investor, has just put in a bid through his holdings company, Vesa Holdings, is putting a bid to purchase Royal Mail. And I think it's been accepted. But what was interesting around the time of the dispute, it was really protracted. I don't know if any of you witnessed the parliamentary committee when they were questioning Simon Thompson, the CEO, about, it was in January or February last year. And it was quite a spectacle. He told lies. And he kind of pretended that, oh, we're really nice to the workers. You talk to any postie and they'll tell you exactly what it's like there. It's not nice. It's not pretty. He told a lie about, for example, these little machines that all the workers have been given that time them. So like my postal worker, she's lovely, Hilary. She comes and I have a little chat with her, but I'm always, after a couple of minutes, I start to feel guilty of talking to her because I'm holding her up. Because if I keep on for too long, this thing in her hand starts beeping, telling her you need to get going, you need to move on. So they're constantly being timed. He was asked about this in the parliamentary committee, and he said, oh, no, it's nothing. It's just us measuring things. We're not putting pressure on our workers. That's not how the workers are perceiving it. So anyway, he was accused of telling lies. very unusually, the parliamentary committee called him back. They had another hearing and they really let rip. They went right in and said to him, you cannot be trusted. So that was very interesting. If you just Google it, you'll find it. But the point about the industrial dispute was really interesting. The union really did struggle, but if you have a good dig around on the Royal Mail's own webpage, you can actually get to the minutes of the meetings, of the shareholders' meetings. So I've had a little look, and there are a number of employee shareholders in Royal Mail, so that made the meetings quite interesting. But also, towards the end of the dispute, the union was in so much despair with the boardroom and the management that they actually went to the shareholders and asked them to step in. Now, interestingly, my digging around on the Royal Mail website came up with nothing after that point. Those discussions are not there. And yet there's so much else that's available with the digging around. So I have written to the union, Dave Ward, their general secretary, and I haven't received a response, which is really disappointing. So I've asked him, I'd love to know how the shareholders responded to you when you pleaded to them. But I do see that as quite an interesting story, even without knowing the outcome. I wonder if there's a space for workers and the unions to actually speak directly with the shareholders. If the management are not doing the job and the management are saying, look, we're looking after the shareholders' interests, maybe just cut them out and go straight, have direct discussions. I don't know. I know that's a very radical way of thinking about this, and I'd be slapped by any lawyer, I know, by making this suggestion, but I just wonder if that is a response that we might use. So it's actually then speaking to the importance of the shareholders, it's speaking to the need to be profitable, but it's also saying, let's be honest with each other. This is where we stand, this is where you stand, we need to find a way to come together, and if the management can't do it for us, let us do it between us.
But sorry, on the shareholders just going to sell out to Fetinsky anyway?
That's quite an interesting question. It relates to one that's come up in the chat as well. I don't know, Louise, if you're online, if you want to come on and ask yourself, or if you just want me to ask it. Do you want to come online?
Hi, sorry, my camera's not set up. Thanks, it was really interesting. So I just wanted to know what you think is the potential for activist shareholders to potentially shift things.
Yes, I mean, I know in the United States, shareholder activism is quite a big, a big group. A big group of activity, and also we have here, don't we, Share Action as a group, and I think that they can be quite impactful, and so I do see potential in that, but I do also see the potential for an inherent contradiction in shareholder activism. If we're saying that this is about undermining capitalism, why would you be a shareholder in the first place? Do you know what I mean? So I slightly worry about that, but definitely in the United States we have unions buying up shares specifically in order to get themselves into the shareholder meeting. So I think that there is certainly potential, at least to influence or to shape some of the discussions. I think that I wouldn't be against that.
I mean, I guess they have to work with the system they're in.
Yes.
We have to work with the system that we're
in. Yes.
I think we've reached that point, Brenda. Finally, I'm going to let you
in. By now, sort of some of these points have been covered, but I mean, that was going to be one of my points, Charlotte. Thank you for absolutely fascinating talk.
Thank you.
We're really delighted that you were able to come and share all of that expertise with us. The participatory shareholder democracy problem is, our system is very stuck, isn't it? I was looking at sort of corporate reform over the last century, and actually very little has changed. And so we have this static system of general meetings. We were talking at lunch about how difficult it is here to bring activist shareholders to bring litigation. So that's not really very promising here. You know, how can we change the system to give the shareholders the role that you want them to have? And actually, while we can attach lots of blame to them, I think we were in our discussions really we're letting the directors away with a lot here.
Yes.
Absolutely. A lot of the shareholders are passive. And of course, some of the very large ones can be quite active, but a lot of it is actually driven by the boards. Which you said yourself, all these narcissistic leaders. So I think we mustn't let them off the hook either. And on the CSDD point, it does look to be a game changer now that we finally have agreed it. But I'm just wondering whether you think actually there will now on this be quite a divergence between the UK and Europe, because the EU countries are going to obviously have to transpose the directive and implement it even over a number of years. But actually, there's been quite a pushback on sustainability issues by the business lobby here, particularly in the last 6 months. They saw the end of Conservative government, and they were very anxious to get things off the books before there's a change of government. And I don't hear anything from Labour that suggests that they are going to advance any of this agenda, because this, of course, is all part of the bigger debate that's been going on for a long time about corporate purpose. And the incoming Labour government in 1997 was very much engaged in this, and it was very much looking towards, at that time, to a version of stakeholder capitalism was all the jargon at the time. Of course, not much came out of that. Eventually, we got Section 172, not much else, but you don't even hear any of that from Labour at the minute. So I'm just wondering if, you know, that the CSDD will send Europe off in a slightly different direction. And in a different direction, definitely, and the UK will actually stick very much with the status quo that we have.
I think there's a real danger of that, actually. Coming to your first question, I agree absolutely that the boards have a lot to answer for. And when we look at all the scandals of over the last just 10 years alone, who's been at fault really? It's been the boards. So Carillion, you know, the non-executive directors and you know, the boardroom itself, they were criticised for being greedy, chasing after the profits. P&O Ferries is another classic. Again, another parliamentary committee hauled Peter Hepplethwaite before that committee, again, about a year ago, and said, what the heck are you doing? Because I don't know if you remember when they told all the crew of the P&O Ferries, right, pack your stuff, you're sacked. They got off the boat. There was a furore, wasn't there? And then all these poor workers from overseas were brought onto the boat. Now, Peter Hepplethwaite at the parliamentary select committee hearing said, "Oh, you know, we had to do it." He didn't apologise. He said we had to do it. He was named later that year as the worst boss in the world, by the way. But he's still the boss there. And in fact, only recently there was another, I think possibly a week ago, another parliamentary select committee brought him back and said, we understand that you're paying your workers something like £3 an hour. Way below the minimum wage. So that tells us something about the problems of our own labour laws. We've got minimum wages that are not being enforced. But also we've got board members who were severely publicly criticised 18 months ago. They're still at it. They're still doing it. So I think, you know, we should be, again, looking at the director's duties more strongly. So that's my answer to that question. And then on the CSDD, yes, I mean, it's really interesting because the UK, in some ways, a few years ago, was kind of a leader of this our own Modern Slavery Act was the inspiration for the CS-DD. The Modern Slavery Act, Section 54, was the one that said companies will need to show in their reports how they're trying to guard against human rights violations. So it was very much a reporting provision, but that, I think, was one of the inspirations for the CS-DD. Of course, there was the business and human rights guiding principles and the OECD stuff, but I think that was part of the picture. Now, looks like we are going to be possibly left behind, because I agree with you. We're seeing definitely movement on the reporting standards, but when it comes to the CS-DD, I think people are a bit like, what do we do? What do we do? Another issue, I guess, would be, it is a directive, so other member states may find that they're presenting things that look rather different from each other. And so that may give room for the UK to say, well, we'll go with the one that offers the lowest. That's a possibility. The incoming government, well, you know, which side's it going to be? If it's Labour, they've not offered any promises around Brexit, have they? But I have seen words about Starmer saying he'll want to align our laws as closely as he can, but who knows? Who knows? I'm not sure. And I just wonder if, I mean, I've never been convinced by this corporate purpose debate. I found the British Academy thing rather disappointing in its outcome. And I just wonder if we've now made ourselves all a little bit tired of talking about this, and we've lost interest in it because new things are happening.
It was sort of peaking before the pandemic.
Yes, it was.
And then the pandemic changed the whole dynamic.
Yes, it did.
And it never revived.
Yes.
As you say, the British Academy report in any event
didn't really come to very much in the end. It started off with an amazing flurry, didn't it?
Yeah.
But in the end, it kind of, what did you get? 2 or 3 reports came out of it, and it hasn't really gone anywhere since. So I'm just, well, another paper I presented a long time ago where I talked about fluffy words, and I think purpose is one of them. You know, trust is another one. They're all nice words, aren't they? But actually, what do they really mean? Whereas I think compassion doesn't have to be a fluffy word. I actually do think there's substance in it, but there is a genuine literature around it, and there are certain entities and organisations that do operate on that philosophy. Servant leadership is a nice example of that.
Thank you, Charlotte. Are there any final thoughts or questions for now, for this part? No. Right. Thank you very much, Charlotte.
Thank
That
you.
really was an incredibly rich and thought-provoking seminar. And I think if you are wondering where to go with sustainable finance attack the devil, you're welcome to bring it back here, and we will see. We will see if we can work out where would be a good place for it to go after it comes here. But that was absolutely brilliant. And also, just having thought, thank you. I'd like to thank Brenda for all the help with organising this. It really was co-organised, and for the benefit of the recording and the room. I'd also like to thank UoS for all their help with organising, the events team within UoS. And also thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Both those of you who are still here online, and also those of you who are here in the room. Thank you very much, and we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you.
And in the
very
meantime,
much.
help yourselves to cake before you go. Right, cake. And you've got to leave it cake.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm sure you do.
Right. I got your email.